8th, Thursday, and we're here at the home of Joe Kurland and Peggy Davis, 389 Adamsville Road in Coleraine, Massachusetts. And I guess I'll start, Joe, by asking you to tell the story of how you ended up in Coleraine.
Well, is the question, how did I end up in this part of New England, or how did I end up in Coleraine specifically?
Well, all right, yeah, right, thanks. So, yeah, how did you end up in this part of New England?
Well, I guess it really started that I was in Seattle, Washington for a while. And I saw an ad for a school that needed a teacher in Western Massachusetts, and I applied for the job and got it. But that was over in Stockbridge, actually the school that Arlo Guthrie went to. And by the time I managed to get to Massachusetts, the school had closed. And I spent a year teaching in another school in that area, got fired for union organizing, and for which everybody congratulated me. And then I found a job teaching in Holyoke at an alternative high school. So I moved to Leverett. I actually found the home I lived in Leverett through a contra dance band. And when Peggy and I got married and we were looking for a place to buy, we knew we wanted to have some land, and we also knew that we wanted to be close to the Greenfield Jewish community. And Coleraine just sort of recommended itself. It was the place where we could actually find a place that we could sort of afford, and we had a few Jewish friends in Coleraine, and or actually we had one Jewish friend in Coleraine, but we found this place and we love it.
And when was that approximately? When you first responded to that job ad?
Oh, that was about 76, 77. And we moved to Coleraine in 90, I think it was.
Okay. I had an opportunity to interview Bob Rottenberg a couple months ago. And
that's who we knew in Coleraine.
That might be the friend that you knew.
Yeah.
And, all right, so I guess you would post-date this, but he told me about how he ended up here, and he was telling me about sort of I guess, I don't know if they were called themselves a Havurah or what have you, but there was a...
Why don't you point the mic at you for when you're talking?
Yeah. Well, I'm not I don't really care too much about miking myself.
Yeah.
Anyway, he'd mentioned this Havurah that existed around here, and I guess if you got here in 1990, that was sort of beyond that point.
Right.
But what did you know? Did you ever hear anything about that group, or was that group at all active once you got here?
No, not that I know of. Once we got here, it really wasn't meeting at all. But also, one of the thoughts that I had was that the Jewish community of Franklin County is so small that I really felt we needed to be involved in the center of that Jewish community much more than in a Havurah. And yet at the same time, we really like to invite Shabbos guests, and so that's the small neighborhood scale that we keep involved in. Besides going to the synagogue.
When you lived in Leverett, were there other Jewish families around that you interacted with?
That's not so much outside of the synagogue. It's funny because we lived in a cooperative household there, and from time to time members of that household were Jewish, but very rarely did they get involved in any Jewish activities.
So maybe you tell me a little bit about the temple in Greenfield and how you found yourself getting involved in that. One of the things I'm wondering is, I think I remember from way back when I talked to you that you grew up in the city.
Right.
And so I'm curious to know, in your view, what makes the temple in Greenfield different from, a temple that one might find in New York City or in a suburb in New Jersey or something like that.
Well, I suppose I could tell the story of how I got involved in the synagogue. Let's see, about 20 years ago, I'm sort of not sure what happened first, but sometime around that time, there was a Hiroshima Day vigil on the Greenfield Town Common, and I came down and I blew the shofar there. And I think I had met Rabbi Reeser once or twice before that. But a couple of days later, I got a phone call from him saying, "I heard you blow a mean shofar. Would you like to go blow shofar for us at Rosh Hashanah?" So that was one thing that brought me into the synagogue. The next thing was that when was this? When the band began performing, began coming together, we needed a place to rehearse. And so we tried this place, that place, the Yiddish Book Center for a while in its first location. We did a little bit at UMass music department. We did some at. We approached the synagogue in Northampton. We approached the synagogue in Amherst, and no place was really. It wasn't really working out at any of those places. Some of them said, well, only when somebody is here from the organization. Another one, well, we have to figure out how much money to charge you. And we approached Phyllis Naiman, who was the president of Temple Israel at that time. And she said, "You want to rehearse here? Oh, we'd be so honored. Anytime you want to come here and rehearse, just let us know and we'll open it up for you." So just feeling the welcome of the community, and it has always been a very welcoming community. So I think it's those things that sort of got me into the community. And then, I don't know, a couple of years later, Rob Oken said to me, with the interests you have, you ought to join the Social Action Committee. I said, "How can I join the Social Action Committee? I'm not a member of the synagogue." He said, "That doesn't matter. You can join the committee without being." So I said, well, I think I have to join the synagogue because it really feels like a home to me. So.
Yeah, now the other part of the question, if I remember correctly, was comparing just your impressions of a comparison that you might draw between a synagogue like this one in Greenfield and an urban or suburban synagogue.
Well, compared to the synagogue that I grew up in or other large communities, I grew up feeling that I was perhaps one of the less knowledgeable people about Jewish studies, Jewish learning, Torah, synagogue skills. When I came here, I felt like, I'm one of the more knowledgeable people. And I think that sort of propelled me into doing more and more and more, because I sort of missed a lot of the things that I grew up with and felt that if I want to have them, I have to do them. And that includes singing, being a prayer leader, singing in the synagogue. I just really missed the sounds that I heard as a kid. And if I wanted to hear that particular type of sound, I had to provide it. One other thing that I would say is just that sense of welcoming. And I won't say that you don't feel welcomed in a big city synagogue, but there are some touches here that are so different. And the first noticeable thing is that there are no tickets for high holiday services. That you want to come, you walk in. There are assigned seats for people who have paid for their seats, but there are also seats that are unassigned. And you just come in and sit down.
And you mentioned Phyllis, and I know I knew her from working at GCC, and also very recently did an interview with her. Now she grew up in Turner's Falls, and it's my understanding that she and maybe a handful of other people in that temple are people who grew up here. And I'm wondering what your sense is within the temple of that community of Jewish people who actually were born here. I mean, how many of them are there from what you can tell, and or what's the degree of involvement? And do you need to pause for a minute? Oh, okay, you're just interested. Oh, okay.
Do you want to join the discussion?
Yeah, you're welcome.
You don't, you have work, yeah. Well, when I first came here, there were many more of those old families, and it's much fewer now. A lot of the children in those families went to college and went somewhere else, and the older people in those families, many of them retired to Florida or have been dying out. So the proportion of those older families has decreased, but they're still represented.
Is the Judaism the same from what you can tell, or does the newer block of people bring in a different mix into the tradition? Do you know what I mean?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if I can answer it completely, but what I would say is that the synagogue in Greenfield is the only synagogue in Franklin County. And it has to serve everybody. And there are more observant people and there are less observant people. And there are people who are more traditional in their observance, and there are people who are more modern in their observance. And this community has to make room for everybody. And it does. And, the older families weren't necessarily more observant, but they may have been more traditional in their observance. For example, they'd come to services in the morning, but then they'd go and open up their businesses in the afternoon on Shabbos. So they meant that, that level of observance might not have been that high, and yet they would be involved. Some of them would be involved, and some of them wouldn't be involved and just come once a year, or whatever it is, but they felt the need to be part of the community. And I have no idea what proportion of the Jewish population of Franklin County are members of the synagogue and how that has changed over the years. But I would also guess that 50 years ago, more of the Jewish population was concentrated in Greenfield. And I think now it's more spread out into the hill towns.
Well, okay, that's a good occasion for the next thing I'm interested in talking about. You're mentioning the hill towns And you'd said before that you ended up in Coleraine partly because you knew you wanted to have some land. One of the reasons why I'm interested in this project is I'm trying to figure out a lot of things, and one of the relationships that I'm trying to figure out is a relationship between Judaism, Jewishness, and a sense of place. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I mean, I'll ask you more prompting questions, but I guess initially, why did you want to live where you had a lot of land around you, and did that have anything to do with your spiritual life?
Well, yeah, I would say so. I mean, having grown up in New York City, but having spent some time as a kid going camping and being out in the woods and having a summer home in I wouldn't call it a very rural community, but in a rural area, I just came to really appreciate being away from the noise and the bustle of the city, and also the outdoors, and just being on the land is a very spiritual thing. I think I also felt something about the history of the Jews in Europe not being allowed to own land for many years, and the feeling that this is a thing that needs to be done, to have a piece of land to take care of as best I can. I'm not sure I have the resources to really take care of it, but even so, just taking care of it from overdevelopment is one thing. Keeping it an organic piece of land. There's a farmer who keeps his cows here, and even though he's not an organic farmer, he once asked, "Is it okay if I plant corn here?" And I said, "Sure, corn's fine as long as it's done without pesticides or any of the synthetic fertilizers." And so, in that sense, I'm doing my part to protect a piece of land.
How many acres?
We have 38 acres here.
Yeah. I wonder if you're spending a considerable amount of time outside, whether you're working outside or walking or something, are there particular texts that sort of come up for you? I mean, do you go in that direction of connecting up, again, time spent outdoors with I don't know, sections of Torah or anything like that?
I'm not that much of an expert on text, and I'm not even sure what the text is for this particular thing, but there are blessings that are traditionally said when you see a beautiful object, a beautiful thing in nature. And even though I don't know the particular traditional blessing, I just feel like to go outside and look at the mist rising off the hills is a blessing. And to go up the hills and see the first leaves coming out, it's a blessing. It's a thing that is just, you just focus on that, and just take in the spiritual nature of being in this spot at this time.
I guess this is another area that relates to this question about land and so on, and is that I guess it's a kind of a fraught question about Jewish people. You mentioned, that whole history of Eastern European Jews not being able to own land. Jewish people owning land for some, the place for Jewish people to own land is Israel. That's where Jewish farmers ought to be. And I wonder how, and I don't mean in any way to be provocative with the question, but it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. So I wonder, where you're at on that. Is there? I mean, one of the things I've been reading lately is different commentaries on this issue of Judaism and sense of place, and there are certain ideas, I guess, in the Talmud about what's, certain places being holier than other places. The holiest place is the temple, and then there are these sort of concentric rings of holiness around it extending to Eretz Yisrael, and that's sort of the last ring of holiness. But, I don't know how you negotiate that, or if you do.
Well, I sort of feel that Judaism has a role in the world, and that involves being everywhere in the world, and that I don't think you have to be in Israel. I think that as a Jew, I'm involved in political things. As a Jew, I'm involved in community things. The ideals that I have learned as a Jew apply to the larger society. In the Torah, it says, God says to Abraham, "You shall be a blessing to the peoples of the world." The people of the world shall be blessed through you. And how does that mean? It means the moral teachings that we have need to be applied to the world, to be a blessing to the world. And, that means standing up for the poor and the orphan and the widow and the stranger, and means standing up for justice and for peace, and it means doing it anywhere. And if there's a purpose in being Jewish, in retaining Judaism, in spite of all the difficulties of being a Jew and all the prejudice against Jews, it means doing that work wherever you are.
Now, earlier, I think it was before the machine was on, we were talking about actually your performance at the Heath Elementary School, and that raises another question, which is, you've spoken to your place as a Jew among other Jews, let's say in Franklin County and the hill towns, but you in particular as a performer, I guess, your Judaism or your Jewishness is something that all your neighbors see. And I wonder what sort of impressions you've formed of, in particular, I guess, in these little hill towns, how you are perceived, how Jewishness or Judaism is perceived by, the guy whose cows graze on your land, or the kids in that school who didn't raise their hands to say that they had, Yiddish-speaking ancestors.
Good question. I guess I don't really know enough about how other people see us, but I think that we're certainly accepted on a friendly basis by our neighbors and people that we meet. In the schools, we get lots of good questions from kids, and they seem really interested in what we have to say. Try to bring to the schools a cultural message rather than a religious message, because there is some reluctance in the schools to, there's a difference between teaching religion and teaching about religion. But I think people are even scared about teaching about religion. But kids ask good questions, and, so much as, do you celebrate, what holidays do you celebrate? Everybody thinks Hanukkah is the Jewish holiday. And, so we do a little education about that. And so far as we see, there's a lot of acceptance about it. And it's important, I think, to, people who've grown up in families where they've never knowingly seen a Jew before, it's a way of breaking down prejudices.
Do you have a sense of, so you've lived here for a bit more than 10 years, a sense of, this is another kind of mysterious entity, but the kind of small town New England cultural sensibility, whether that's, translates to town politics or how people greet one another when they see one another. But do you have a sense of that kind of rural New England identity, and how one as a Jew can relate to that? I mean, are they a fit for each other?
I'm not sure I know how to answer that. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know how to answer that. Maybe answering that requires stereotyping of some sense. I don't know if there's a New England character or a Jewish character.
Yeah, and I'm eager to not go in that
direction.
But on the other, it's true that there aren't those things, or those are ideas that are important to resist. But there is whether we see it or not, there is a rural New England culture. Mm-hmm. There's a New England sensibility, but anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that. I feel welcomed within the cultural community, the wider cultural community. And even so, we're not the only ethnic group that's relatively recently arrived to New England. And, the New Englanders we meet are really from a pretty wide variety of backgrounds. You have French Canadian, you have Polish, you have Italian, you have Jewish and non-Jewish refugees from the cities, or transplants. Maybe they're not really refugees. So I think to some extent, a lot of those other subcultures are sort of losing their connections with their roots. And it's interesting too. And one of the things when we went into the school, Aaron's school, to do little presentations on Jewish culture or whatever, we've encouraged some of the teachers to talk about their own cultural backgrounds. And I think that the Coleraine School is going to be doing a multicultural program next year, bringing in a lot of different cultures that are represented in the community. One other thing that I'm really delighted about the Coleraine School, from the time that Aaron was in preschool, the teachers stressed values of inclusiveness and sort of the rainbow of people that make up America. And I think that's one of the things that that's made it feel comfortable to live in Coleraine.
Yeah, I mean that in yeah, to me that's a useful example, because thinking on rural New England culture, well, that may be a characteristic that takes us out of the realm of stereotypes. That there is a tradition of tolerance
Yeah.
among small town New Englanders, and so yeah, that's interesting. Oh, you know what? You mentioned way back, I think this is what brought something or other brought you into the community, was you mentioned the contra dancing.
Mm-hmm.
And the other day I was telling somebody about this project I was doing. And he said, oh, well, you should just go to all the contra dances, because that's where all the rural New England Jews are. Contra dances. So is that true? I mean, do you run into a lot of Jewish people at those?
Let's say that I haven't been to a contra dance in quite a number of years, but I'm definitely met a lot of Jews at contra dances, but I don't know that they would have been a large percentage of the population at contra dances. It's just so you could certainly find them there.
All right. Last thing I'd like to ask about is the CJRNE
Mm-hmm.
and the history of your involvement in that, and just how that group has enriched your Jewish cultural life living here.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I mentioned that when I got to this community, I found, to my I don't know what the word is, surprise in a way, or anyway, that I was one of the more knowledgeable people about Jewish learning in the community. And going to the conference makes me feel like, oh, now I'm surrounded by teachers. And even though actually I'm teaching there, but I'm surrounded by people who know much more than I do, and oh, that's so nice. Not responsible for carrying that much of the burden of teaching the traditions when I go to a place where there are people who know more than I do.
Well, thanks very much.
Yeah, I'm not in any hurry.
Yeah. Is this the record? Oh, that's the record.
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing is our work. Here we are in the middle of nowhere doing Yiddish music, and we find people who want Yiddish music for their weddings and bar mitzvahs, and I'm sure we would have more work if we lived in New York, for example, but we travel around, and
when you say travel around, you mean beyond New England?
yeah, we do some traveling beyond New England, although most of the traveling is New England or Eastern New York. And it's a little difficult sometimes to not have a larger Yiddish-speaking community from which to renew ourselves. But it's very nice to find the interest and to be able to do this kind of work. And then there's the work that Peggy does, which I'm working with her on. I don't know if...
I don't think I know.
Well, maybe we should go into the studio and have a look at her stuff. So
Yeah, great.